Margaret Elwood had never imagined that loneliness could echo louder than grief. But after her husband Thomas passed away 5 years ago, silence had become her only companion. Her house, a beautifully aged Victorian on the outskirts of Portland, had once echoed with laughter, holiday dinners, and the warm buzz of family. Now, it was just her and the soft tick of the antique grandfather clock Thomas loved so much. At 60 years old, Margaret had made peace with her solitude, or so she told herself each morning over tea and toast. Life had settled into a routine. Morning walks, tending to her rose bushes, volunteering at the local library on Tuesdays, and calling her daughter Harper once every other week. Harper had moved to Seattle after her divorce, trying to piece her life back together. Margaret missed her fiercely, but tried not to interfere. She understood the sting of a failed marriage, and the slow ache that followed. It wasn't her place to burden Harper with her own empty evenings. So when Darren Bellamy, Harper's ex-husband, showed up on her doorstep on a rainy Wednesday, holding a small bouquet of carnations and an apologetic smile, Margaret was startled. He looked thinner than she remembered, his once proud posture slightly hunched, his eyes weary but still strikingly blue. Darren had always been charming, too charming perhaps, and it was part of what had drawn Harper to him and part of what eventually broke them apart. I was in the neighborhood, he said, water dripping from his coat, and I couldn't not stop by to see how you were. Margaret hesitated for a heartbeat but stepped aside and motioned him in. Old habits die hard, especially when they come cloaked in familiar faces. She made tea, served it with butter cookies, and listened as Darren talked about how things hadn't gone so well since the divorce. His startup had failed. He'd been staying in short-term rentals, trying to pick up consulting gigs. He didn't ask for pity, not directly, but his stories had a well-rehearsed cadence of gentle victimhood. Margaret nodded and offered small consolations. She knew better than to ask about Harper. That bridge was long burned, and she had no intention of rebuilding it through her acceptance. Still, there was something disarming in Darren's tone of loneliness that mirrored her own. When he thanked her for listening and left with a grateful smile, Margaret thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Darren came back the next week, this time with groceries. Thought I'd return the kindness, he said. He fixed a leaky faucet, changed a light bulb in the hallway, and laughed at her old stories like he still belonged. Margaret found herself smiling more that week than she had in months. Darren never tried to force conversation about the past. He kept things light, gardening, books, Portland traffic, and Margaret appreciated that. Soon, his visits became regular. Every Friday evening, he would stop by with some excuse: pasta for dinner, a new thriller he thought she'd like, or just checking in. Her neighbors noticed. Of course, Muriel from across the street asked, "Isn't that your daughter's ex-husband?" Margaret had smiled politely and said yes. She didn't owe anyone explanations. She was allowed company, wasn't she? One evening, as rain tapped gently on the windows, Darren brought up an investment opportunity. It wasn't a big deal, he said. Just a promising tech firm in Eugene looking for local partners. He didn't need cash, just collateral. A co-signature on a document to help him secure a short-term loan. Nothing changes with the house, he promised. It's just on paper. You'll still own it, legally and otherwise. It's just a formality. Margaret felt a chill crawl down her spine. Why not go to your parents? She asked. They're in Florida now, and you know we're not close. He gave a sheepish laugh. You're like family to me, closer than family, really. You've been kinder to me than my own mother. The flattery tugged at her heart. She had always considered herself a good judge of character, and Darren had never been cruel to her, not even when things with Harper had turned sour. She didn't know the full story of the divorce, but she remembered Harper's tears and silence. Still, people change, people grow, and maybe, just maybe, Darren was trying to start over. Margaret asked for time to think. That night, she sat on her favorite armchair by the fireplace, holding the unsigned paperwork. She called Harper but hung up after the second ring. She couldn't explain it, not without sounding foolish. She imagined Harper's reaction, cold, clipped, and full of "I told you so's." Margaret wasn't ready to be judged, especially by her own daughter. The next morning, she called her attorney, Mr. Whitaker, who had handled her will after Thomas died. "I just want to know," she said carefully, "if I co-sign a deed for someone's business loan, what am I risking?" Well, Mr. Whitaker replied, depending on how the deed is structured, you could be transferring partial ownership. If they default, Creditors could come after the house. It's not a light matter. Margaret's stomach nodded. She thanked him, hung up, and told herself she wouldn't sign. But the following Friday, Darren arrived with soup, flowers, and a story about how the deal was slipping through his fingers. I just need a little faith, Margaret, he said. Everyone deserves a second chance. And somehow, that was the sentence that pushed her over the edge. She had needed second chances too. After Thomas died, when she forgot to pay bills, when she left groceries on the bus, when she cried during Mass for no reason. Maybe helping Darren was a way to give meaning to her own pain. I'll do it, she said softly. He hugged her, whispered thank you, and promised to handle everything with the utmost care. You won't regret this, he said. Over the next few days, Darren arranged for the paperwork to be signed at a local notary. Margaret wore her nicest coat, applied light blush to her cheeks, and even polished her shoes. She didn't tell anyone, not even Harper. She didn't want judgment, just a clean heart. At the notary's office. Darren handed her a pen and said, "This is just procedural." Margaret glanced through the pages. It all looked standard, full of legal jargon she barely understood. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed. The notary stamped the document, and Darren smiled. Later that night, Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the quiet walls and the empty seat across from her. A strange unease settled in. She reminded herself it was nothing, just old age, or maybe just the change in routine. But something had shifted, and it wouldn't take long before that subtle shift became a landslide. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of Margaret Elwood's kitchen as she stood at the sink, hands deep in a soapy basin of breakfast dishes. The scent of lemon detergent wafted through the room, mixing with the comforting aroma of percolated coffee. The day should have felt ordinary, like so many before it. But something inside Margaret stirred uneasily. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she had signed the paperwork for Darren's loan. He had visited her once since then, dropping off a box of gourmet tea and thanking her profusely again, but otherwise had grown distant. His usual texts and check-ins trickling into silence. At first, she chalked it up to the new business keeping him busy. But, as the days passed, Margaret's instincts began to whisper things she didn't want to hear. She found herself rereading the document she had signed, still tucked away in the drawer by the hallway phone. Despite having read it 3 times already, the language remained dense, layered in legal clauses and passive voice. She thought of calling Mr. Whitaker again, but something, perhaps embarrassment, held her back. She couldn't admit she had gone through with it after all his caution. Later that afternoon, Margaret decided to go for a walk to clear her head. Her route, once filled with cheerful waves from neighbors, now felt muted. She kept her eyes low, passing the vacant lot by the church and circling back through Rosewood Street. As she neared home, a man in a blue jacket emerged from a white sedan parked in front of her house. He had a clipboard and an official-looking badge clipped to his chest. Mrs. Elwood, he asked politely. I'm Peter from the county records office. I just need a quick signature confirming you were made aware of the recent title modification on your property. Margaret blinked, heart-skipping. Title modification. Yes. Partial transfer of ownership was filed about 10 days ago. It's routine. Just a signature to verify acknowledgement of record update. Her mind blurred. I'm sorry, what exactly does that mean? Peter glanced at his clipboard. Well, it appears that one Darren Bellamy now holds 49% ownership of your residence. The document indicates you co-signed to secure a loan, and this structure was submitted as collateral. Didn't your legal counsel explain? Margaret felt the weight of his words like a stone in her chest. She managed a smile and told him she would review it with her attorney before signing anything else. He nodded, offered his card, and left. Inside, she stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the framed photo of her and Thomas from their 30th anniversary. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the drawer and yanked it open. She spread the papers across the dining table and began reading again, line by painful line. Now that she knew what to look for, it was clear. Darren hadn't just used the house as a backdrop to secure a loan. He had filed her home as joint collateral, formalized into deed modification, and effectively tied her future to his failures. The betrayal stung sharper than she could bear. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was that he had weaponized her trust, her loneliness, her desire to matter. She had been vulnerable, yes, but not naive, or at least, she hadn't thought she was. Her thoughts spiraled. What if Darren defaulted? What would happen to her house? Her last tangible connection to the life she had built with Thomas. Would she lose the garden she tended every spring, the attic filled with her daughter's childhood drawings, the porch where she read books in the quiet dusk? She couldn't sit still. She dialed Darren's number. It rang 4 times, then voicemail. She left a brief message. Call me. Urgent. An hour passed. Then, another. No response. Desperate. Margaret drove to his listed apartment, a tidy complex near Hawthorne Avenue. The manager told her he had vacated a week ago, said he was going on a long trip, the woman explained with a shrug. Didn't leave a forwarding address. Margaret's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Her instincts had been right. Darren was gone. That evening, she called Harper. She hadn't intended to. Not yet. Not until she had all the facts. But emotion overruled caution. Harper answered on the second ring, her voice flat. Hey Mom. Margaret didn't know how to begin. I made a mistake. There was silence. Then Harper said softly, what did he do? I signed something. A deed. For Loney said it was just on paper. But he filed it, the house. He owns part of it now. Harper's voice hardened. Please tell me you're joking. Margaret could feel the shame rise like a wave. He said it was temporary, that it wouldn't affect anything. I thought I was helping. You thought you were saving him, just like I once did. Harper sighed, heavy, with a bitter knowing. I tried to warn you, Mom. I know, Margaret whispered. You did. Let me come down this weekend. We'll figure something out. Don't sign anything else. Don't talk to anyone from the bank without a lawyer. All right. Margaret ended the call with tears brimming in her eyes. Not just because of the mess she was in, but because of the familiar pain she'd heard in Harper's voice. She had let herself believe she knew better believed. Darren's sweetness was sincere, but now she saw the truth through Harper's eyes, and it made her feel smaller than she had in years. The next morning, she contacted Mr. Whitaker. She explained everything, every detail, every signature, every omission of truth on Darren. He listened patiently, then said he would begin reviewing public filings and determine what recourse was available. It's not hopeless, he assured her, but it won't be easy. That day, Margaret barely ate. She moved through the house like a ghost, touching the walls, the staircase banister, the kitchen table, as if trying to memorize them. What if they weren't hers much longer? That evening, she sat in Thomas's old recliner, clutching the edges. You'd have seen through him, wouldn't you? She whispered aloud. You always could read people better than I could. She thought about all the times she had dismissed her own gut feelings, how many small red flags she had ignored because Darren brought her soup, called her mom, and made her feel like she wasn't just some forgotten widow. But now, her house, her sanctuary, was a pawn in someone else's game. A few days later, Margaret received a certified letter. It was from the lending institution. It confirmed the mortgage activation, with both her and Darren listed as co-borrowers, but the payment had been missed. They were issuing a 15-day grace period before initiating formal proceedings. Margaret felt her breath catch. The timeline was collapsing faster than she could manage. She called Harper again and told her everything. This time, Harper didn't sound angry, just resolute. I'm coming this weekend. We'll call Amelia. Who's Amelia? Harper's voice paused. His ex-wife before me. She went through hell too. She might be able to help us. Margaret furrowed her brows. You never told me he was married before. There was a lot I never told you, Harper said quietly. But maybe it's time we both stop protecting him. Margaret nodded, even though no one could see. Yes, it's time. As she hung up the phone and looked around her living room mat, the stitched pillows she had made in her 30s, the grandfather clock Thomas had repaired 100 times, the antique mirror that once belonged to her mother Margaret made a decision. She would not let this house slip away, not without a fight. And Darren Bellamy would soon realize that a 60-year-old woman with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The gray clouds hung low over Portland as Margaret sat by the window, sipping lukewarm tea that had long lost its flavor. Her fingers trembled slightly around the porcelain cup, not from age but from the emotional weight pressing on her chest. The house felt colder than usual that morning, not from the weather but from the echoing emptiness of betrayal. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It had turned oppressive, a constant reminder that the man she had trusted had deceived her. Margaret hadn't slept properly since she received the certified letter from the bank. Her thoughts tumbled in restless loops. How could Darren vanish just like that? How could she, a woman who had once prided herself on being strong and perceptive, have fallen for his lies? Shame curled in her gut like a snake, biting at every shred of confidence she had left. She thought again of Harper. The call they had shared days ago lingered in her memory. Not just because of the concern in Harper's voice, but because of something deeper, a kind of forgiveness wrapped in resolve. Margaret didn't deserve it. She had dismissed her daughter's warnings, chosen to trust a man Harper had once loved and lost for good reason. Now, she realized just how much Harper had endured alone. It was late morning when Harper arrived. She parked her dusty Subaru out front, stepped out in jeans and a navy blue raincoat, and walked briskly to the door. Margaret opened it before she could knock, and for a long second they stood in silence. Then Harper pulled her into a tight hug. No words, just the warmth of a daughter's arms around her aging mother. Inside, Harper dropped her bag on the couch and looked around. Everything looks the same, she said softly. I've tried to keep it that way, Margaret replied, but it doesn't feel the same anymore. They sat at the kitchen table, where Margaret laid out the paperwork, the loan documents, the deed modification, the foreclosure notice. Harper flipped through them methodically, her eyes scanning with focus. He didn't just trick you, Mom, she finally said. He planned this. Margaret nodded slowly. I wanted to believe he was trying to rebuild his life. He made me feel useful again. Wanted. Harper's face softened. That's exactly what he does. He finds where it hurts and offers comfort, until he takes what he wants. There was a beat of silence before Margaret asked, tell me what happened with you and Darren. I need to know now. Harper exhaled and leaned back in the chair. We met when I was 29. He was charming, ambitious, and said all the right things. He made me feel like I was the most brilliant woman alive. But slowly, it shifted. He started using my money for investments that never showed returns. He controlled who I saw, what I spent, where I went. Every time I questioned him, he'd turn it around, make me feel guilty, like I wasn't supporting him. Margaret's heart clenched. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, Harper said quietly, but I could tell you liked him, and part of me was embarrassed. I didn't want to admit that I, a smart, capable woman, had been manipulated. I figured if I left quietly and moved on, I'd be free. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. I wish I'd listened more. I wish I'd asked better questions. Harper gave a half smile. We both ignored signs. What he's good at masking red flags as flowers. They spent the rest of the day calling Mr. Whitaker, researching Darren's loan terms, and gathering any paper trail they could find. But Margaret could feel the storm brewing beneath Harper's composure. She had known Harper to be fiery in her youth, quick to challenge injustice. But this was different. There was something sharper in her daughter now, a precision, fueled by years of pain, finally finding direction. It was just after dinner, while cleaning dishes side by side, that Harper mentioned Amelia. She was his first wife, long before me, she said, scrubbing a pan. I only met her once, briefly, during a court hearing. She looked haunted, like someone who had seen the inside of a trap and barely escaped. Margaret dried her hands and turned to her. You think she help us? She might. I found her on LinkedIn last year. She works in real estate now. Maybe she knows more about how he's done this before. Margaret hesitated. Do you think it's right to involve her again? If she went through what we did, maybe. She's been waiting for a reason to fight back, Harper said. We can't do this alone, Mom. They agreed to reach out. That night, Harper sent Amelia a direct message, short and careful. I know this is unexpected, but I believe Darren is targeting my mother the way he targeted you and me. If you're willing, We'd like to talk. Asterisk to their surprise, Amelia responded the next morning. Asterisk I was waiting for this day. Let's meet. I have things to share too. Asterisk they arranged to meet at a quiet cafe near the downtown waterfront. The cafe was sunlit, with soft jazz playing in the background and the gentle hiss of espresso machines providing white noise. When Amelia walked in, Margaret's breath caught. Asterisk she was elegant mid-40s, dressed in a cream blouse and tailored slacks, with hair swept neatly into a bun. But beneath the polish was an edge, a woman who had rebuilt herself from something broken. She greeted Harper with a brief hug, then turned to Margaret with a firm handshake. I've heard a lot about you, Mrs. Elwood. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Please, call me Margaret, she replied. They sat down with coffee, and Amelia wasted no time. Darren's done this at least 3 times that I know of. Once with me, once with an older woman who was a friend of his aunt, and now you. He finds women in transitional phases, widows, divorcees, retirees. He flatters, creates dependence, then attaches himself financially. Asterisk Harper leaned in. Did he take your house too? Asterisk almost, Amelia said, her voice tight. But I caught it in time. I had a friend in law enforcement who helped me flag the paperwork before it went through. After that, he left. Didn't even try to fight. He just vanished. Asterisk Margaret's throat tightened. How did you recover? Asterisk it took years, Amelia said. Financially, emotionally, everything. But eventually, I got into real estate so I could help women in situations like mine. That's how I learned the language Darren uses, the patterns. Asterisk Harper glanced at her mother. We have to bring him down. Asterisk I agree, Amelia said, but not with fury alone. He's careful. He relies on women reacting emotionally while he operates legally. If we want to beat him, we need strategy. Asterisk Amelia offered to review the deed filings, cross-reference business loans, and see if Darren had any active property transactions. If he's trying to leverage your house, she said, he's likely doing it elsewhere too. He doesn't just con people, he runs schemes, layered ones. Asterisk Margaret was overwhelmed but also oddly relieved. For the first time since Darren disappeared, she didn't feel helpless. She was angry, yes, but beneath the anger was something more powerful, resolve. Asterisk they left the cafe with a plan. Harper would continue working with Mr. Whitaker on legal recourse. Amelia would dig into Darren's known contacts, banks, and any local records she could access through her agency. And Margaret would no longer sit passively in her armchair, waiting to be saved. Asterisk that evening, back home, she walked into her bedroom and opened a box from the closet. Inside were letters from Thomas, his old watch, a few faded photographs. She held one up. It was from their first year in the house, when they had just painted the living room and spilled blue paint on the hardwood. They had laughed for hours. Asterisk, I'm sorry, love, she whispered. I let someone put this house in danger, but I promise you I will not let him win. She placed the photo back carefully and closed the box. Margaret Elwood was not just a victim of a con. Asterisk, she was a woman preparing for war. Asterisk, the sky that morning was pale and indifferent, casting a washed-out light over Margaret Elwood's front lawn as she sat on the porch, wrapped in her beige shawl. Her tea had gone cold in the ceramic mug resting on the railing beside her, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the empty street ahead, though her mind wandered far from the quiet Portland neighborhood. It had been a week since she, Harper, and Amelia had met at the cafe. A week of long phone calls, legal consultations, and shared files. A week of hoping Darren would resurface so they could confront him, expose him, and take back what he'd stolen, but he hadn't. Darren Bellamy had vanished again. Margaret wasn't surprised anymore. Disappointed, yes. Tired, absolutely, but not surprised. Darren's ability to disappear when responsibility came knocking was now a fact, not a theory. Still, it stung. His absence wasn't just a physical disappearance, it was a withdrawal of every false word of kindness, every feigned gesture of loyalty. She had wanted to believe that maybe, somewhere deep down, he had a conscience. But people like Darren didn't carry guilt, they carried charm like armor. Asterisk that morning, Mr. Whitaker had called her. We've hit a legal wall, he explained. Without his signature or cooperation, we can't modify or reverse the deed. Your name's still there, but his ownership stands unless we prove fraud or coercion. Unfortunately, the loan papers don't help. They're too clean. He knew exactly what he was doing. Asterisk Margaret thanked him and hung up. staring down at her wrinkled hands. So much of her life had been about preservation, preserving her home, her dignity, her family. Now, for the first time in decades, she felt the edges of those things crumbling beneath her. Inside, Harper was making calls. Her voice filtered faintly through the open window. No, we still haven't located him. Yes, his social security is on file. That's correct. Joint ownership, initiated by notarized agreement. Margaret sighed and rose from the porch, stepping back inside. The hallway smelled of lavender and old wood. She looked at the grandfather clock, again Thomas's favorite. Its ticking used to soothe her. Now it sounded like a countdown she couldn't stop. Harper ended the call and turned toward her. Still nothing, she said. No bank activity. No new leases under his name. It's like he slipped into fog. Margaret nodded. That's what he does best. Harper hesitated. Mom, there's something else. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What? I did some digging, and I found out Darren had been trying to get in touch with another woman. Her name's Lillian Vaughn. She lives in Eugene. Margaret tilted her head. How do you know that? Amelia found her through real estate databases. He listed her as a reference on a condo application 6 months ago. Amelia called the complex, pretending to be a bank officer, and confirmed the details. Margaret narrowed her eyes. And you think he's trying to scam her, too? Harper crossed her arms. I think he already has, but it gets worse. Lillian owns a small vacation cabin in the mountains, a property recently put on hold because of a pending lien. It smells like Darren's handprints. Margaret felt her stomach churn. He's doing it again. Harper nodded. Amelia's going to try to contact Lillian. But we need to decide what we're doing here. If we don't act soon, he might sell off his share of this house or worse, default completely and leave us legally exposed. Margaret's fists clenched at her sides. This is my home. I won't let him ruin it. Or me. That afternoon, she walked through every room in the house, the floral wallpaper in the dining room, the hardwood floors she and Thomas had refinished together, the bedroom where Harper had been born. Each corner was soaked in memory, and yet, now, each step felt like trespassing in her own life. By the time she reached the attic, dust floated through shafts of sunlight like snow. She opened the cedar chest near the back wall and pulled out an old photo album. There were pictures of family reunions, Christmas mornings, Sunday brunches with friends now long gone. Then she found a more recent photo taken by Darren during one of his early visits. She was holding a pie, smiling softly. He stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Looking at the picture now, Margaret shivered. Not from the cold, but from realization. She remembered how that photo had been staged, how Darren had insisted she smile, had moved her to the light for a better angle. It had felt sweet at the time. Now it felt staged, calculated. She closed the album and descended the stairs. Suddenly, exhausted. Later that evening, Amelia called. I spoke to Lillian, she said. It took some convincing, but I told her my story. Yours. She broke down crying. He did the same thing to her, Margaret. Same words, same tactics. Promised to help her fix up the cabin in exchange for partial property rights. Margaret swallowed hard. Did she give them to him? She signed a preliminary access agreement. It's not binding, but he's clearly working on turning that into something permanent. Margaret felt her rage simmer. What do we do? We get ahead of him, Amelia said. I have an idea, but it'll require some bait. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What kind of bait? Amelia explained her plan. It involved Margaret pretending to cave to call Darren and claim she had come around, that she would finalize the deed transfer if he returned. He won't be able to resist. His ego won't let him. Harper was hesitant at first, protective instincts flaring. You're asking my mother to talk to him again, after everything. I won't say a word he doesn't deserve, Margaret replied, her voice firmer than it had been in days. Let's do it. The trap was set. Next morning, Margaret left a voicemail on Darren's number. Her voice was deliberately shaky, vulnerable. Darren, I've been thinking about things. I know I overreacted. You've always looked out for me, and I shouldn't have doubted you. If you're still willing, I'd like to sign the full deed over to you. Make it official. Come home. We'll talk. Asterisk, they waited. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then, on the 3rd day, just as Margaret was beginning to lose hope, Darren called. Asterisk, his voice was syrupy smooth. Margaret, I've missed you. I'm so glad you called. I knew you'd come around. Asterisk, she played her part. I want to make it right. You've done so much for me. Asterisk, they agreed to meet at her home that Friday. Margaret hung up, then turned to Harper and Amelia. Let's end this. Asterisk, on the day of the meeting, the house was spotless. Margaret wore her best sweater, the one Thomas had always said made her look radiant. The papers were prepared not for a transfer to Darren, but for a legal reversal of the original deed, backed by evidence of emotional coercion and predatory behavior. Amelia had secured a court-ordered recording waiver. Everything said that today would be admissible. Asterisk. When Darren walked through the door, he was all charm. His smile was wide, his arms open. There's my favorite lady, he said, moving to hug her. Asterisk. Margaret stepped back. Let's sit down. He blinked, but complied. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Darren leaned forward. I knew you'd see it my way. You're not like other women, so wise, so compassionate. Asterisk. Margaret looked him in the eye. You're right. I am not like other women. I see through you now. Asterisk. His smile faltered. What's this about? Asterisk. Margaret slid the new papers across the table. You're not getting the deed, Darren. In fact, you're losing the house. Asterisk. He chuckled nervously. You can't do that. You signed it. It's legal. Asterisk. Amelia stepped in from the hallway, followed by Harper, holding a file of evidence. You manipulated her. We have recordings, statements from other victims, and your pattern of behavior documented. Asterisk. Darren's face paled. This is entrapment. Asterisk. No, Margaret said coldly. This is justice. Asterisk. Darren stood abruptly, eyes darting. You'll regret this. Asterisk. No, she replied, her voice steady. You will. Asterisk. As he stormed out, Margaret felt her chest lift with something unfamiliar. Pava. She turned to Amelia and Harper. Thank you, she said, voice trembling with relief. Asterisk. You did this, Harper said. You stood up for yourself. Asterisk. Margaret walked to the window, watching Darren disappear down the street. For the first time in months, the house felt like hers again, not just in title, but in spirit. And she vowed, right then and there, that no one would ever take that from her again. Asterisk. The wind howled against the window panes as dusk crept over the Elwood house, carrying with it the weight of a week's worth of confrontation and closure. Darren's sudden exit from her home just days prior still echoed in Margaret's memory, like the distant roll of thunder. She replayed the conversation in her head a dozen times since, each moment sharpening in her recollection. The way his confident smirk had crumbled into panic, the hollow threats he had thrown as he retreated, and the final, satisfying stillness that fell over her home after the door had closed behind him. Asterisk. But Margaret Elwood was not the type to rest on a single victory. She knew better than to believe Darren would simply vanish forever. People like him didn't fade quietly. They lurked, waiting for shadows to lengthen again. And this time, Margaret would not be caught unprepared. Asterisk. After Darren's departure, she and Amelia filed the necessary legal documentation to formally revoke the joint deed, citing fraud, coercion, and pattern-based evidence from multiple victims. Amelia, with her real estate expertise, had meticulously outlined how Darren's manipulation fit within a consistent scam framework. Mr. Whitaker supported the process with legal muscle, pushing the paperwork into expedited review. Asterisk. Still, there was no guarantee. Courts moved slowly, and Darren had a history of slipping between the cracks. Asterisk. One morning, Margaret awoke to find a thin white envelope tucked inside her mailbox. No return address, no postmark. Her name was written in neat, familiar cursive. Her heart pounded as she slid her finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Asterisk. It read, Asterisk. You may think you've won, but I've already moved on. The house won't keep you warm when they take it from you. D. The paper trembled in her fingers, not from fear, but fury. It was his final card threat through subtlety, fear through implication. But Margaret was no longer the woman who once signed documents blindly. She had faced Darren's cruelty and survived it. More importantly, she had stripped him of his power, exposing him to others, refusing to be his pawn. Asterisk. She walked straight inside and called Harper and Amelia. Within the hour, they met at Margaret's dining table once again, reviewing the letter and coordinating their next steps. Asterisk Amelia set down her cup of coffee with a frown. This letter is meant to destabilize you, to remind you that he still knows where you live and how to get inside your head. But he's losing control, and that's when people like him get sloppy. Asterisk Harper nodded. We need to ensure there's no way for him to cause further damage. What about the property transfer? Where are we with the revocation? Asterisk Margaret pulled out a folder. Mr. Whitaker submitted everything. We're just waiting on the hearing. In the meantime, I've changed all the locks, updated my will, and removed any joint listings tied to Darren. Utilities, taxes, even the gardener, everything's in my name now. Asterisk Harper exhaled, proud but cautious. Good, then let's finish this. Asterisk the next few days were spent reinforcing Margaret's legal protections. Amelia connected her with a property protection agency that specialized in elder fraud victims. They installed cameras, reinforced her home insurance policy, and reviewed her finances for vulnerabilities. Margaret, once reluctant to involve the world in her private pain, found herself strangely empowered by the process. Taking action, no matter how small, had become her form of healing. Then came the hearing. It was held in a modest courtroom, the air stale and the fluorescent lights flickering just slightly above. Margaret, dressed in a navy blue blazer, with her silver hair pinned back, sat beside Mr. Whitaker. Across the aisle sat Darren, alone. He looked smaller than she remembered, paler, his usual bravado diminished under the weight of legal scrutiny. Asterisk, when the judge asked for arguments, Mr. Whitaker presented the timeline, how Darren gained Margaret's trust under false pretenses, how he misrepresented the terms of the deed, how he leveraged that trust into financial gain. He introduced Amelia's sworn affidavit and Harper's supporting testimony. The judge listened without interrupting. Asterisk, then Darren was asked to speak. He rose, adjusting his cheap tie, and tried to explain that the agreement had been consensual, that he had acted in good faith, and that misunderstandings were being exaggerated. But Margaret stood. With permission from the court, she walked to the front and addressed the judge directly. Asterisk, I am not a naive woman, she began. I am a widow, a mother, a retired teacher. I've lived in that house for 40 years. I've paid for it, maintained it, and watched it fill with memories. Darren Bellamy came into my life pretending to care not because he loved me, but because he saw an opportunity. I gave him tea, I gave him kindness, and he repaid me with legal theft. I didn't sign away my home. I was tricked into handing over trust. There was silence in the courtroom as she returned to her seat. The judge didn't offer a verdict immediately. He said he would review all submitted documents and issue a ruling within a week. Asterisk. That week crawled. Asterisk Margaret filled the days with movement. She tended her garden, repainted the hallway, and organized boxes in the attic. Anything to keep her mind from looping around worst-case scenarios. Harper stayed for most of it, providing company and reassurance. Occasionally, Amelia dropped by with legal updates and light-hearted stories to keep spirits lifted. Asterisks. Then, on a bright Tuesday morning, Mr. Whitaker called. Asterisk, the court ruled in our favor. Asterisk, Margaret froze. You're serious? Asterisk, the deed is officially reversed. Darren's name has been struck from the records. Your house is yours, Margaret, entirely. Asterisk, tears sprang to her eyes, but she didn't sob. Instead, she laughed, a full-bodied, joyous laugh that shook her shoulders and made Harper look up from across the room. Asterisk, what is it? Harper asked. Asterisk, it's done, Margaret said, the smile widening on her face. It's truly done. Asterisk, that night, Margaret hosted a dinner, just a small gathering. Harper, Amelia, Mr. Whitaker, and her two neighbors who had watched her suffer in silence. She cooked her late husband's favorite stew and baked a lemon tart from scratch. They sat around the table, eating, drinking, sharing stories. Asterisk, there was no dramatic toast, no fiery declarations of revenge, just laughter, warmth, restoration. As the guests left and the house fell quiet again, Margaret walked through the rooms. She touched the dining table, now cleared and shining. She glanced at the fireplace, glowing gently. She opened the front door and stood on the porch, looking up at the stars. Asterisk, she thought about Darren not with hate, but with clarity. He had tried to make her feel small, insignificant, powerless, but in the end, she had taken that attempt and turned it into strength. Asterisk Harper joined her, a cup of tea in hand. You did it, she said, her voice full of admiration. Asterisk, no, Margaret said softly. We did it. Asterisk, they stood there a while, mother and daughter, side by side in the quiet of the night. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in waves in courtrooms, in phone calls, in handwritten letters, and in silence. And as the wind rustled the trees and the stars blinked above them, Margaret Elwood knew that while the scars would never vanish, neither would the courage it took to earn them. This house, this life, was hers again, not just by law but by will, by fight, by fire. And she would never give that up again. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains, bathing the Elwood house in a calm golden light. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh linen. As Margaret tidied up the breakfast dishes, humming a song her mother used to sing, her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind wandered elsewhere, to the courtroom, to the letter Darren had sent, to the quiet victory that still echoed within her bones. It had been several days since the judge's ruling officially restored the deed solely to her name. The legal nightmare was over. Margaret had won. But victory, she was learning, didn't always come with fanfare or a parade. It arrived gently, quietly, leaving behind both relief and a strange emptiness. She no longer had to fight, but now came the question. What was she supposed to do with the life she'd reclaimed? Harper had returned to Seattle the day before, hugging her mother tightly before leaving. "I'm just a few hours away," she'd said, "and I'll come back soon, maybe for Thanksgiving." Margaret had nodded, grateful yet feeling the slight sting of parting. She was proud of her daughter, proud that she had grown stronger after Darren, proud of the way she had helped her mother navigate the same manipulations. They had bonded in pain and resilience. And while Harper's departure left a quiet space in the house again, it didn't feel lonely this time. It felt earned. It felt peaceful. Margaret took her tea to the front porch and sat in the wicker chair Thomas had built years ago. The wood creaked under her, familiar and welcoming. She watched the neighbors tend to their gardens, walk their dogs, wave politely as they passed. A few of them now looked at her differently, not with pity, but with something akin to respect. They had heard whispers of what happened, and they knew Margaret hadn't just survived. She had fought. Her phone buzzed on the small patio table beside her. It was Amelia. "Good morning," Margaret answered. "Morning," Amelia replied cheerfully. "How's it feel to be queen of your own castle again?" Margaret chuckled. "Strangely anticlimactic." "That's because you're used to fixing things. You're always looking for the next problem to solve." "And now I don't have one." Amelia paused, then said, "Actually, I might have something that could interest you." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." "There's a non-profit here in town that works with women over 50, widows, divorcees, retired professionals. A lot of them have been financially abused, scammed, or manipulated like you were. They run a mentorship program. I told them a little about your story, and they're very interested." Margaret was silent for a moment, digesting the idea. "You think I'd be good at that?" "I think you'd be brilliant," Amelia said. "You're calm, empathetic, and you've lived it. These women don't need lectures. They need someone who understands the language of loss and the weight of starting over." Margaret sipped her tea slowly. "Send me the details." Later that afternoon, she received an email from a woman named Vanessa Quinn, director of the program. It was warm, professional, and inviting. The organization Graceful Rising held monthly support groups, legal education sessions, and financial literacy workshops. They were looking for peer mentors to guide women through their recovery journeys. Margaret didn't reply right away. She read the email 3 times, then she got up, opened her bedroom closet, and pulled out a small leather box that held letters she had written to herself over the years, some during her grief after Thomas passed, others during moments of doubt or joy. She opened one, dated 2 years ago, written in shaky cursive. Some days, I'm not sure who I am without someone to care for. I want to matter again, not to fix anyone else but to feel useful, needed. I still have something to offer. Margaret smiled to herself and closed the box. She opened her laptop and typed a reply to Vanessa. Thank you for the opportunity. I'd love to meet and learn more. I believe my story might help others find theirs again. The next few days moved with gentle purpose. Margaret met with Vanessa at a local community center. They walked through the space sunlit rooms filled with chairs in circles. walls lined with inspirational quotes, shelves of pamphlets and resource guides. Vanessa introduced her to two other mentors, Barbara and Denise Bothwam, funny women in their 60s who had faced their own struggles. Barbara had lost her retirement savings to a crooked financial advisor. Denise had been isolated by an emotionally abusive partner for 2 decades. They shared their stories openly, and in doing so, created an unspoken bond with Margaret. There was no judgment, no competition of who had suffered more, just shared understanding. That evening, Margaret walked home feeling light, almost young again. The following week, she led her first group session. 7 women sat in a circle, eyes cautious but curious. Margaret introduced herself simply. My name is Margaret Elwood. I'm 60 years old. I'm a widow. And not long ago, I nearly lost my home to someone I trusted. The room was silent. I believed I was helping someone. I believed that being kind meant being generous with everything, including my security, and I was wrong. But I'm not ashamed of that anymore, because I learned that my empathy isn't a weakness, it's my strength. I just needed to learn how to protect it. Heads nodded slowly. One woman, Ginny, petite with tearful eyes, said, I gave my son full control of my bank accounts after my husband died. I thought I was being smart. I didn't want to deal with it all. Another Teresa, tall with silver-streaked curls, added, my ex drained my retirement. I had no idea until I tried to buy a car and my account was empty. Margaret listened. She didn't interrupt. She simply held space, the way Amelia once held space for her. Afterward, Vanessa pulled her aside. You're a natural. I'm just being honest, Margaret replied. That's what they need most. Back at home, Margaret started a small journal, not for herself, but for other women like her. She wrote down thoughts, reflections, affirmations. She called it the second bloom, inspired by the rose bushes in her front yard that had somehow managed to survive frost after frost. You are not foolish for having trusted. You are not weak for having loved. You are not broken for having been betrayed. You are simply growing again, wiser, bolder, and beautifully changed. Weeks passed. The house grew quieter, but it no longer echoed with grief. Margaret painted the guest room a soft lilac and turned it into a reading room. She ordered a rocking chair online and placed it near the window, where the morning light hit just right. She started baking again, not out of habit, but joy. She even joined a local book club. One afternoon, she received a letter not from Darren, but from Amelia. Inside was a short note. He's officially under investigation. Lillian filed a report. We did it. And beneath the note, a small gift, a keychain engraved with the phoenix. Margaret smiled. She clipped it onto her house keys and held them tightly. This home, this life, was hers. Not because a judge declared it so, but because she fought for it, piece by piece. Because she refused to be defined by what was taken from her, but rather by what she rebuilt. She stepped out onto her porch that evening, the sun casting a golden hue across the street. Children laughed in the distance. A breeze rustled through the trees. And Margaret Elwood, 60, widowed, once betrayed, stood tall and unshaken. Her story wasn't one of loss. It was one of reclamation, of fire rediscovered, of a life finally lived on her terms. The days melted into each other with a graceful rhythm as autumn painted the streets of Portland in deep hues of amber, crimson, and gold. Margaret Elwood found herself greeting each morning with a kind of purposeful calm she hadn't known in years. Her porch, once a space of idle gazing, now hosted steaming cups of tea, thick novels, and journal entries filled with bold thoughts. Each time the breeze rustled the orange-tinged leaves on the trees, she took it as a sign that things were finally shifting inside her as much as outside. Margaret had become a regular at Graceful Rising, the non-profit where she now mentored women like herself, those who had trusted the wrong people, lost something dear, and were on the long road back to wholeness. Every Thursday, she led a support circle. The group had grown, 10, then 15, then 20 women, from every walk of life, each with their story of quiet betrayal and unexpected resilience. Some had been conned out of money, others had been emotionally manipulated, isolated from families, or left without shelter. In every story, Margaret heard echoes of her own. She began to find a strange kind of peace in her new role. It wasn't just that she was helping others, it was that in hearing their pain, their shame, and their triumphs, she better understood her own. She was no longer simply the woman who had been deceived by her daughter's ex-husband. She was now Margaret Elwood, a guide, a fighter, a woman who knew the language of starting over. Asterisk yet, beneath all of this new stability, a faint thread of unease remained. Asterisk because Darren Bellamy had not vanished completely. Asterisk the investigation Amelia mentioned had not led to his arrest at least not yet. He had disappeared again, perhaps sensing the noose tightening, but there were signs, small flickers on the radar. A credit check that flagged his name connected to a new address in Arizona. A Craigslist posting under a pseudonym that matched his writing style. Amelia had forwarded everything to law enforcement, but it was clear Darren wasn't finished. He was simply regrouping. That knowledge lingered like a shadow in Margaret's otherwise sunny days. One Tuesday evening, after returning from the support group, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing dinner. The house was quiet, the only sound, the soft bubbling of the stew on the stove. As she stirred, she heard the faint creak of the mailbox slot. Curious, she wiped her hands and walked to the door. Asterisk inside the box was a plain manila envelope. Asterisk no return address. Asterisk she hesitated, her breath catching, but curiosity won. She opened it with steady fingers. Inside was a stack of photographs, photos of her house, the garden, the porch, one of her through the kitchen window, watering her violets. Her heartbeat slowed, and then surged in panic. No note, no name, just the pictures. Asterisk, she quickly locked the door, and pulled all the blinds shut, her hands trembling. This wasn't just a message, it was surveillance. A warning. Darren was watching. She called Harper immediately. Her daughter answered, voice groggy. Mom, everything okay? Asterisk Margaret swallowed hard. He was here. Asterisk what? Asterisk he's been watching the house. I just got pictures. Recent ones. Asterisk Harper's voice sharpened. I'm calling the police, and I'm coming down tomorrow. Asterisk Margaret didn't argue. She knew better than to face this alone. Asterisk by the time Harper arrived the next day, Margaret had already met with an officer who took her statement and photographs, but with no fingerprints, no clear threat, and no known address for Darren, there was little they could do beyond opening an investigation. Asterisk, why is he doing this? Harper asked, pacing the living room. The court's already ruled. He can't touch the house anymore. Asterisk, he doesn't want the house anymore. Margaret replied quietly. He wants control. Asterisk, Harper sat down, burying her face in her hands. I hate that he still finds ways to get to us. Asterisk, Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. He hasn't broken us. We're still here. Asterisk, they decided together that Margaret wouldn't leave her house. Darren had already taken enough, but that she would increase security. Amelia arranged for a private security consultant to install motion detectors, door alarms, and outdoor lighting. The local precinct agreed to include her street in their nightly patrol rotation. Asterisk still. The peace that had settled over Margaret's life began to fray. Asterisk that weekend, Margaret cancelled her group session for the first time. She didn't want to show fear, but she also knew she wasn't ready to face a circle of vulnerable women when she herself was shaken. Instead, she stayed in, kept her doors locked, and reread Thomas's old journals, his musings on life, loss, and healing. One passage stood out. Asterisk, when you've been hurt, the world becomes a forest at night, but you light one lantern, then another, and before you know it, you've made a path. Asterisk, she closed the book, tears wetting her lashes. Maybe this fear was just another part of her path. Asterisk, the next day, she returned to Graceful Rising. She didn't lead the group that time. She sat with them, listened, and when it was her turn to speak, she didn't tell them what had happened. Not yet. Instead, she said, Asterisk, sometimes, healing isn't linear. It circles back, tests us, but it doesn't erase what we've already overcome. We carry our victories with us. Asterisk later that night, Margaret received another letter, this time, slid under her door. Her heart jumped as she picked it up. Asterisk, but when she unfolded the paper, she was stunned. It wasn't from Darren. It was from Lillian Vaughn. Asterisk, the woman Darren had almost conned into giving him rights to her mountain cabin. She had heard about Margaret through Amelia and wanted to meet. I've taken back my property, the letter read, but I still feel like I've lost something, my sense of judgment. I'd like to hear how you found yours again. Margaret folded the letter slowly and set it beside her tea. That night, she didn't sleep with the lights on. She didn't check the windows 5 times. Instead, She wrote back to Lillian. The next week, they met at a small cafe in Salem, midway between their towns. Lillian was tall, strong-featured with graying red hair and sharp, watchful eyes. She spoke in clipped sentences, her voice full of quiet bitterness. He made me feel seen, she said. It wasn't even about the cabin. I hadn't felt like someone paid attention to me in years. I know that feeling, Margaret said. It's not foolishness. It's hope. Lillian's face softened. You don't blame yourself. Not anymore, because I survived, and so did you. They talked for hours, exchanging stories, wounds, and laughter. By the end of it, Margaret felt something shift again, not backwards this time, but forward, a new kind of strength. Lillian joined Graceful Rising the next month. Darren, meanwhile, went further underground. The police tracked some of his movements, but lacked enough evidence for a warrant. Amelia remained in contact with local authorities, and Margaret stayed vigilant but not afraid. She planted new roses in the backyard, a deep crimson variety she named Redemption. She started teaching a class at the community center on financial awareness for retirees, and she resumed her group sessions, this time stronger, clearer, more open, because Margaret Elwood had not just survived Darren Bellamy, she had exposed him, and now, wherever he went, there would be women like her, waiting, watching, prepared. Her life was no longer marked by what she had lost, but by who she had become through the loss. A protector, a mentor, a woman who no longer feared the shadows because she had learned how to light her own way through them. Margaret Elwood stepped into her modest kitchen just as the morning sunlight caught the rim of her tea kettle, casting a soft gleam across the tiled counter. The air outside had grown crisper, autumn giving way to early signs of winter, but within the walls of her old Portland home, warmth lingered. The scent of cloves and cinnamon drifted from the stovetop, where a pot of apple cider simmered. The rhythmic sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway created a peaceful backdrop to a life recently reclaimed. She reached for 2 mugs from the cabinet, not out of habit, but anticipation. Today, she wasn't sipping alone. For the first time in a long while, Margaret had guests arriving not for sympathy, not out of concern, but to learn from her, to find strength in the story she had lived and the power she had found in telling it. When she opened the front door, she was greeted by 3 women, Lillian Vaughn, now a regular at Graceful Rising and one of its most vocal advocates, Barbara, a retired nurse with a sharp tongue and a wise heart, and Denise, who had once arrived to her first group session, trembling and silent but now laughed easily and stood taller. Margaret smiled, stepping aside. Come in, I made cider. They entered with familiarity, shedding scarves and jackets as if they were coming home. And in many ways, they were. This house had become more than a place of personal recovery. It was a symbol, a sanctuary, a lighthouse for others lost in the storm. They gathered in the sunlit living room, mugs in hand, each woman nestled into a chair. Margaret remained, standing, looking out over her guest friends. Lillian took a slow breath. I want to share something with you today, she began, her voice firm, yet warm. Something I haven't told the group. Something that matters now more than ever. The room quieted, the weight of her words settling between them. She set her mug down and retrieved a small box from beneath the side table. Inside were the photographs Darren had sent her weeks ago, the ones taken of her through the windows of her garden, her porch. She handed the stack to Lillian, who passed it along. I received these not long after the court ruled in my favor, Margaret said. They were taken without my knowledge. No note, no return address, just a reminder from him that he was still watching. Barbara's eyes narrowed. Sick bastard. Lillian's hands clenched. Did the police find him? No, Margaret said. He disappeared again, and for a few days, I was scared. I locked the doors twice. I unplugged my lamps at night because I thought he might cut the power. I even cancelled a support session. She sat down now, her expression calm but resolute. But then I remembered something I had forgotten in the fear. He doesn't win just by stealing money or property. He wins by stealing peace, joy, identity. And I realized I wasn't going to give him that. Denise, always the quietest, spoke. So, what did you do? Margaret smiled. I put wind chimes on the porch. I planted new roses. I started opening my blinds again, and I began inviting people back into my home not to hide, but to live. They sat in silence, letting that truth settle. It was not just about reclaiming a house, it was about reclaiming one's sense of self. Lillian looked down at the photographs again. I remember when he made me feel invisible, like I couldn't trust my own instincts. Now I trust them more than ever. And I remember thinking I was too old to start over, Barbara added. But every day I get up and make my own decisions, that's starting over. They talked for hours, sharing stories of progress, of triggers they'd learned to navigate, of boundaries they had finally built. They spoke of family members they had reconnected with, or finally let go of. Margaret listened with admiration. These women had not just survived betrayal, they had transformed it into something sacred, purpose. Eventually, they left hugs, exchanged plans for a holiday gathering discussed, and reminders to keep sharing their strength with others. After they were gone, Margaret remained seated in her living room, staring at the now empty mugs. She thought about the person she had been just months ago, only unsure, a woman who had equated trust with love and sacrifice with worth. And then she thought about the woman she was now, someone who had taken a wound and turned it into a torch. Later that evening, she received a call from Vanessa, the director of Graceful Rising. I just wanted to say thank you, Vanessa said. Lillian told me about your gathering today. You've helped more women than you know, Margaret. Margaret chuckled. They're the ones helping me. Well, we were also wondering if you'd consider taking on a new role, more official. Vanessa continued. We'd like to appoint you as a senior mentor. You'd oversee our regional outreach efforts, especially to women in rural areas where these scams are even more common. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She looked around her home, remembering when she had nearly lost it, both the building and what it symbolized. She thought about the women who came through her door, carrying pieces of her own story in their hands. I'd be honored, she said. The following week, Margaret stood before a crowded hall in a local community center, addressing over 6 women at an outreach seminar. She wore a navy blue scarf and a pearl brooch that had once belonged to her mother. Her voice carried through the room, steady and sincere. Most people think when we fall victim to fraud or manipulation, it's because we're naive, she began. But I'm here to tell you, it's not about intelligence. It's about trust. It's about love. And those are not weaknesses. They're the very things that make us human. She paused, letting her words breathe. But what matters most isn't what they took, it's what we take back. Our choices, our dignity, our future. Applause followed, not raucous or forced, but genuine, earned. Later, as women approached her, thanking her, hugging her, sharing pieces of their own journeys, Margaret felt something anchor in her chest. Not pain, not fear, but certainty. She was not just healing anymore, she was leading. That night, back at home, she sat on her porch, watching the wind move through her roses. The redemption blooms were thriving now. Despite the cold, she sipped tea and opened her journal. At the top of the page, she wrote, I gave away my house, once nearly lost everything. Then, I gave something else away, my story, and this time, it saved someone. As she closed the journal and set it aside, she noticed something resting on the porch railing, a small envelope. For a moment, her breath caught. But as she approached, she saw the familiar looping cursive of Lillian's handwriting. For your next meeting. The note inside read, a candle for the table, to remind us, we are never in the dark alone again. Margaret lit the candle that night, placing it in the center of her kitchen table. Its soft glow filled the room, flickering against the worn wallpaper and family portraits. It illuminated not just the space, but the journey she had taken through, betrayal, fear, and shame to arrive at this exact moment of quiet power. She looked around her home, her sanctuary, not just reclaimed, but reborn. And she whispered into the silence, a vow, you watched me from the shadows once, now I live in the light. And I will never dim again. The morning air was thick with mist as Margaret Elwood opened the windows of her restored Victorian home, letting in the smell of damp earth and pine from the yard. The rising sun painted soft streaks of gold across the floorboards of the hallway, casting long shadows on the framed family photos and flower vases that now stood proudly along the shelves. She walked with steady steps, each footfall a silent echo of the journey she had taken, one paved in heartbreak, betrayal, resilience, and victory. It had been 6 months since the courtroom had restored her home and her name to full legal authority. 6 months since Darren Bellamy, her former son-in-law, had last attempted to haunt her life. Though he had not been seen since his sudden disappearance, whispers of his scams were still being tracked in circles. Margaret now worked within, but she no longer feared him. He had become what all cowards eventually become, a shadow of himself. Margaret, on the other hand, had transformed into something radiant. The house was no longer just a dwelling place. It had become a symbol of survival, a meeting ground for women rediscovering their strength. Since her appointment as senior mentor at Graceful Rising, Margaret had led dozens of outreach events, spoken at universities, and even appeared in a podcast interview that garnered national attention. Her voice once quiet and reserved, now a tool for empowerment. She stood in her living room now, adjusting the centerpiece on the coffee table, a delicate candle with dried lavender petals pressed into the wax. A gift from Lillian. She lit it gently, the flame dancing to life like a living memory. Today was not just any day. Today marked 1 year since Darren had first stepped back into her life. 1 year since he had knocked on her door with carnations and a gentle voice, cloaked in lies. It had started as a promise of comfort, transformed into manipulation, and nearly cost her everything. But it had also been the moment that forced her to rise, to live again, to reclaim herself. As the morning passed, Margaret busied herself in the kitchen preparing for the small gathering she had planned. Tradition she decided to begin, the day of reclamation. It would be celebrated each year on this date, not to mourn what was lost, but to honor what was taken back. The table was dressed with a lace runner. Tea was steeped in a vintage pot with lemon wedges, laid out on a ceramic plate. Small pastries, fresh from the bakery, were placed in a curved dish she hadn't used in years. When the doorbell rang at noon, Margaret opened it to see Harper standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Thought I'd bring something less ominous than carnations this time, Harper said, with a smile. Margaret laughed, the sound easy and warm. These will do just fine. Behind Harper came Amelia, carrying a leather-bound folder. Updates, she said simply, but I promise no paperwork at the table. Lillian arrived next, wearing a bright red scarf that fluttered in the wind. I made apple tart, she announced, and I'm staying for the whole afternoon. Soon, others from the group trickled in. Barbara, Denise, 2 new women from the latest outreach circle. They all gathered in the living room, sipping tea and trading stories. But there was something different in the air this time, not just strength, but celebration. Margaret stood and gently tapped her spoon against her mug, calling for a moment of attention. Thank you all for being here, she said. Today isn't about Darren or any of the people who tried to take something from us. Today is about what we chose to reclaim, our voice, our peace, our future. She paused and looked around the room, eyes shining. Exactly 1 year ago, I was afraid. I thought I had made the greatest mistake of my life. I believed that losing my home meant losing everything. But what I learned is this: when someone tries to take from you, they underestimate what you're capable of rebuilding. They see what you gave, not what you still have. But today, look at us. Look at what we've made of our stories. The room erupted in gentle applause, heads nodding, eyes misty with shared memory. Harper leaned over and whispered, I'm so proud of you, Mom. Margaret smiled, the kind that lives deep in the soul. I'm proud of you, too. After the toast, Amelia pulled out the folder she had brought. I promise no paperwork, she said, but there's one thing you should all know. She flipped it open and laid it on the table. It's official. Darren Bellamy has been indicted in 2 states, one in Oregon and one in Arizona. Multiple counts of fraud and elder exploitation. Gasps filled the room. Margaret leaned forward, eyes wide. They found him, she asked. Amelia nodded. He tried to start another scam under a fake name, but one of the women he approached had heard your podcast, Margaret. She recognized the pattern. She reported him. Law enforcement matched the name and face. He's in custody now, bail denied. Asterisk, there was a beat of stunned silence before applause broke out again, this time louder. More thunderous. Asterisk, Margaret didn't cheer. She closed her eyes and took a long breath. Not in triumph, but in release. Asterisk, when she opened them again, she whispered, "It's over." Asterisk, that night, after the guests had gone, after the plates had been cleared and the candle had burned low, Margaret sat alone in her reading room. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl and opened her journal. Asterisk. She flipped through pages of old entries, each one a breadcrumb trail through her grief, her awakening, her return. And then she wrote, "1 year ago, I was afraid, asterisk, afraid of growing old alone, afraid of being irrelevant, afraid of starting over. Then came the lie. Then came the loss. Then came the fire. I was burned, but I didn't vanish. I rose, and in doing so, I lit the way for others. Asterisk, this home is no longer a hiding place. It is a lighthouse, and I will keep it lit for every woman finding her way through the dark." Asterisk, she closed the journal and walked into the garden. The roses bloomed in the moonlight, bold and red, the redemption variety she had planted in spring. Asterisk, she knelt beside them, touched one of the petals, and whispered, "Asterisk, you can grow again. You always can." Inside, the clock struck midnight, and just like that, a new year began. Not marked by fear or betrayal, but by reclaiming, remembering, and rising. Asterisk, Margaret Elwood, once nearly erased, now stood immortal in her own quiet revolution, not as a victim, but as the story others would follow when they were ready to rise to. Asterisk.